Avalanche, Heretical Reflections on the Dark and the Light by Dr. Brugh Joy. And this is Chapter 6, Induction Through Ritual, Rites of Passage, and Crisis. Rituals and rites that make them up have been used since antiquity to change states of consciousness. Or, in the language I prefer, they have been used to induct from the interior community those selves that have specific resources and possibilities that the ordinary self does not. Rituals that involve entering either an external or an internal sacred site or temple are good examples. So is the ritual of the Mass, or the rituals around marriage, birth, and death. A ritual is not something invented by the outer mind for entertainment or as a show or display. Ritual, when carried out with conscious intention and reverence, is a sequence of experiences that can evoke and then give direction to changed consciousness. These states have resources that can augment any action or process, whether it be healing, affecting the weather, or communing with Source. Certain rituals, those surrounding rites of passage, are also pathways by which the death of one stage of life and the incarnation of the next stage can occur. In ritual, one goes through sequences of changes in consciousness to reach into parts of self that are not usually perceived as self. The specific pathway is innate, already established within the unconscious. Each part of the pathway must be followed and in sequence. In baking a cake, a specific pathway, a recipe, must be followed. If the result is to be a cake, one cannot pull all the ingredients except water into a pan, place that combination in the oven, cook it, and then add water. One cannot put all the ingredients except water into a pan, place that combination in the oven, cook it, and then add water. One will get a result, but not the intended result. The same is true with ritual. When the priest transubstantiates bread and wine in the Catholic ritual of Mass, meaning that the priest has already reached a state of consciousness where the bread and wine actually are. At the psycho-spiritual level, the body and the blood of Christ, which in turn symbolize a mystery beyond the body and blood of Christ. The self, who usually is that priest, is not present. Through the ritual, the priest changes vehicles and enters the aspect of the inner self that can perform the act of transubstantiation. The priest's ordinary sense of self does not and cannot learn how to and never will be able to transubstantiate. It does not have the resources. Through the ritual, however, the ordinary self seems to withdraw as the consciousness is absorbed into a more transcendent state. The ordinary self learns to die in quotes, to another part of self that now knows, always has known, and always will know how to substantiate. Transubstantiate. Will always know how to transubstantiate. Transubstantiation involves changing one substance into another, and the principle of transubstantiation is active, whether one is changing bread and wine or changing a vehicle of consciousness. The self that can transubstantiate is first inducted in the novitiate by a priest that can substantiate is first inducted. Let me start the sentence again. The self that can transubstantiate, the self that can transubstantiate is first inducted by a priest who is already able to transubstantiate both himself and the bread and wine. The ritual itself is merely a scaffolding to direct the awareness toward the sublime, while the state of consciousness infusing the ritual is what has the real power to induct the corporate church into the transcendental. Therein lies the power of the ritual for the collective. Unfortunately, only rarely does one experience a priest who can achieve the transcendent state that the celebration of the Mass is intended to bring about. The way I approach ritual is to observe many rituals that deal with the same theme, synthesize what I've learned, then do one myself. Finally, I teach one. The learning sequence called see one, do one, teach one is probably a universal training technique, although I initially encountered it in medical school. It is effective. Just a minute. It is effective and necessary because seeing is not the same as doing, and doing is not the same as teaching. All three are required for a person to gain the full empowerment offered through any ritual. First, a person goes on a coattail trip and is inducted into the ritual states of consciousness by being with someone who knows how to enter those states and has the power to engage the ritual forces. This is equivalent to the C1 stage. Though the effect of the forces on the inductee is strong, it is relatively minor compared to what is experienced by the inductor when he or she is in a state of consciousness that actually empowers the ritual. This is why any spiritual priesthood guards the enactment of its sacred rituals, since actually practicing the art of entering heightened states of consciousness to perform the rituals showers the individual with all the associated resources. Thus, the inductee must next demonstrate his or her capacity to enter the heightened state of consciousness without an inductor present. This ensures that the capacity to enter heightened states of awareness has been completely transferred to a new individual, and finally, the newly empowered person inducts someone else into the state of consciousness, which allows that additional individual to perform the ritual for others, thus completing the three-stage experience for oneself and ensuring continuity through time. My realization that seeing is not the same as doing, and doing is not the same as teaching, was very important, and it came about as a result of the following experience. From time to time, in order to maintain my medical license, I am required to review my skills at cardiopulmonary resuscitation. During the presentation of the latest findings and changes in the techniques of the cardiopulmonary resuscitation, most, if not all, of the physicians in attendance are drumming their fingers with boredom or are doodling. The material, except for the new information, is quite familiar to them. Then a most embarrassing situation occurs. It happens when the time arrives for what is called the practical. The physician must change from being a passive listener who intellectually knows the information to being a person who can actually perform the new techniques. This transition is not smooth for most of them, as the chaos in the training room usually demonstrates. Whereas a physician may have virtually total recall while listening to the information. The same physician may not have the information available when action is required. The problem is not just one of performance anxiety, but it's also one of state-bound consciousness. The fact is that one's awareness is complex and constantly fluctuating from one resource to another, and with the result that the self that was listening knows the material, including the new material, but the self that must perform the doer, which is very different and much more complex self, may have access to only the part of the information, or perhaps none of it. Thus, one can talk and talk and talk and think and think and think about induction processes, but have little knowledge during the experience itself and be able to produce only limited results, and maybe nothing at all. Conceptual realization is not the same as experience. In all my conferences, we explore induction through ritual, and in foundational conferences, I watch the confusion on people's faces when I say the part of them that's listening to what I'm saying is not the part that will be able, for example, to do the healing work. That part will never be able to heal. Its job is to listen, to think, and to be ordinary. Another self is already in the healing state of consciousness. One's task is to let go of the ordinary and enter the extraordinary. Rituals that deal with individual and collective healing can do just that, reconnecting us to the source that actually does work. We at the outer level don't do it, just as simple brew doesn't do it. One of the most powerful experiences that I have ever observed in ritually inducted healing states of consciousness occurred while I was still practicing traditional medicine in Los Angeles. I was invited to witness the charismatic Christian Catherine Kuhlman, Kuhlman, calling in the Holy Spirit for the healing of members of her audience. Before the service started, I, along with various other physicians, rabbis, priests, nuns, psychologists, nurses, and other healthcare professionals, was invited to come on stage and be seated in a section that would permit direct access to those who were affected by the healing service, if I wished to examine them. Ms. Kuhlman began simply with an opening prayer, soft music, and song. Slowly, she built the forces in her audience, until after an hour, during which the lighting, music, prayer, and preaching all combined with increasing intensity, I could feel that the whole auditorium was in an unstable field of energy. As Ms. Kuhlman entered her most inspired state, she called for members of the audience to come on the stage. By now, people were falling down, crying, screaming, praising, and praying. It was formidable. I felt as if my own body might collapse if I attempted to move about in the vortex that she was inducting. Many of the individuals sitting in my section, those who had been invited to act as conservative and objective witnesses, including the doubters, the reporters, and the doctors, were swept up in the forces and awakened to find themselves on the floor after having passed out when Miss Kuhlman touched their bodies during the service. I was really moved by what I saw and felt. It was definitely not something out of medical literature. It was powerful, emotional, and electric. Investigation of her work by other traditional physicians. Investigation of her work by other traditional physicians had demonstrated that a full spectrum of possible results came about from the healings that seemed miraculous to no response at all. But physical healing, as a goal, seemed less important to her than entry into some kind of a heightened state of consciousness that invoked mental and emotional catharsis, followed by inspiration and high-level well-being. I have since observed the same phenomena and the same results when charismatic healers of any faith, or no doubt at all, work with heightened states. With charismatic healers of any faith or of no faith, all work with heightened states of consciousness. So Christians don't hold a monopoly, but the forces she invoked continue to amaze me, even today, 15 years after the event. Importantly, the ritual, which Ms. Coleman would call forth the healing energy, was the same each time. And Catherine Coleman, the woman who initially came on stage, was not the same Catherine Coleman who was there at a critical stage when the laying on of hands phenomena began to occur. She would pass through a ritualistic series of changes until she reached the state that took her, so to speak. Whether one is healing or conducting a mass, a change from the ordinary consciousness into extraordinary consciousness is required. As members of an audience, we are empowered through the heightened state of consciousness of the inductor, but are actually entering the inducting state. Doing so directly is usually precluded. The same is true if we are patients in the hands of a physician, for if we are only passive, we will benefit to some degree, but miss the augmented healing interaction that can be ours when we take an active role in our own healing. To deal with this matter of the observer's passivity, I sought a way that all the participants in any healing interaction might directly enter into and partake of the sacred inducting states of consciousness. And the next section here is called the Rosette Ritual, a circle of healing. A process I evolved is the essence of simplicity. It can be used with any number of people, though gatherings of several hundred or more people are preferable, since the effects both of the induction into heightened states and of activating the healing potentials of the group are greater as the number of participants increases. The only thing required is sufficient space for the entire group to be able to divide into smaller groups of 6 to 7 people. Before proceeding with the introduction of this induction process, we need one additional understanding. We need to understand about physical touching. Touch is primary. It is probably the most ancient of our sensory systems. Even the eyes and ears are nothing but specialized touch organs responding to photons, to sound vibrations. I have had 2 powerful realizations about the experience of physical touch. The first, an extension of my recognition that the self who learns is not the self who does, was the self who touches is not the self who feels and appreciates the touch. The second was that the deep psyche doesn't know who or what is doing the touching. It reads the patterns. It simply knows it has been touched and recognizes the quality of that touch, while only the intellect pays attention to such superficial details as who or what did the touching. Therefore, when you touch yourself with the same caring and compassion as you would touch a sick friend, an injured animal, or someone who requested your most caring and healing attention, your deep psyche only knows you have been touched by a compassionate, heightened, healing energy and is not concerned at all with who did it. By integrating these two realizations, we can vastly augment the experience of the collective healing ritual. We can explore the amazing difference between touching ourselves or another person while in an ordinary state of consciousness, and touching ourselves or another while in a heightened state of consciousness. We can also sense the difference between the doer self and the receiver self at both the ordinary and transordinary levels. Preparation. Just prior to the commencement of the ritual, an individual who will not participate is selected from the large group to act as group leader to guide the entire experience. Alternately, a tape recording of the instructions can be made in advance and played to orchestrate the actual ritual, so everyone gathered can be fully involved. For the convenience of those who prefer a pre-recorded tape or who desire to experience how I actually bring this ritual through 4 groups, I have prepared a professionally recorded audio tape cassette for the entire ritual sequence. The group leader now asks the large group to break up into small groups of 6 or 7 persons apiece, then asks those in the small groups to number off sequentially, starting with 1, until each person has a number. The size of the small groups is important, since working with fewer than 6 people can be less satisfying energetically and technically, and working with more than 7 people simply takes too long. Breaking into smaller groups might seem to diminish the effect of the process, but it does not, for the ritual itself is being conducted in the context of the larger group. Thus, a synergistic effect comes about as the small group members work with one another and simultaneously work as parts of the overall group field. At this point, the leader announces that heightened energy can cause some individuals to lose consciousness. If any person does begin to lose consciousness or feel faint at any time during the experience, he or she should just sit or lie on the floor and wait for the feeling to pass, rejoining the group when doing so seems appropriate and comfortable. The group leader points out that the experience passes quickly and does not harm the individual, but since most people are unaware that such a phenomenon can occur, they could be frightened if they were not warned ahead of time. If any individual does elect to sit or lie on the floor, the group simply fills in and continues the ritual without that person. Most group rituals proceed smoothly without anyone having to take these measures, however. With these logistical considerations out of the way, the ritual itself can commence. The ritual. The group leader asks the members of each small group to form a circle without holding hands and to attune inwardly to the sacred for a minute or 2, with their hands on their hearts. During this time, each person is quietly aligning with an inner harmony and well-being. Images that are sacred to the individual are called to mind. These can be images of sacred beings, a spiritual teacher, or inspiring phenomena in nature. A line of poetry or an uplifting melody might also be used for this inner attunement. Each individual is reminded to touch his or her heart area with the same sensitivity and compassion he or she would have for someone in need. Next, the group leader asks the members of each group to close their eyes, hold hands, and attune to the energy of the small group for a minute or two. Then, as the group members hold hands with their eyes closed, the group leader asks each person to visualize having stepped into one of the great cathedrals or temples of the world. Each person is asked to visualize a wondrously radiant energy bathing the cathedral, the temple, protecting, harmonizing, and heightening all who are within it. Thus, the room is energetically sealed and protected. Instead of a great cathedral or great temple, some individuals visualize ancient temples, sacred ritual centers, such as a circle of massive stones or a beautiful natural setting. The important point is for them to use images and impressions that are individually sacred and that have the capacity to cause a change in their state of consciousness. The group leader now asks the individual who are designated as number 1 to enter the center of their circle, and with their hands on their heart, to prepare to receive an influx of heightened energy. The people in the center of the small circle groups are now referred to as the center partners. Those forming the circle are referred to as the circle partners. The circle partners are asked by the group leader to reattune to their own sacred images and to one another. The group leader asks the circle partners to turn the right side of their bodies toward the center of the small group circle and to move closer to the center partners, so their own right sides are gently nestling the person in the center. The circle partners' left hands are placed on the shoulders or backs of the partners in front. Their right hand is placed on their own lower anterior chest area, the heart center. The circle partners are asked to connect to an infinite source of energy, which manifests outward at their heart center like an artesian well. They are further asked to explore the attributes of the heart center, feeling the compassion, innate harmony, the healing presence, and the experience of unconditional love. First, one attribute, and then the next, one by one, slowly and experientially, with significant pause between each to permit an unhurried experience. The group leader suggests that the circle partners feel as though they are connected to all those individuals who have ever experienced the embrace of compassion, and let that feeling pervade their own sense of beingness, also feeling as if the compassionate embrace is reaching through their sense of self to embrace others in the circle and in the room. The group leader asks that the circle partners each feel as if compassion itself is embracing them, rather than they're simply feeling compassionate and sharing this feeling with others. It is important for them not only to feel the embrace, but also to feel the embrace reaching through themselves to others. Each of the additional attributes of the heart center, the healing presence, innate harmony, and unconditional love is handled in exactly the same way, guided by the group leader. The initial induction introduces the ritual participants to the concept of levels of consciousness beyond the ordinary sense of time and space. The rational mind has a real struggle when I ask each person to connect to all those individuals who have ever lived, who have felt the embrace of compassion. Yet, through the mystery of the inner imagination, such an experience is psychologically possible. The moment I suggest that the group members are in touch with a larger beingness in time and space, both the individual energy and the group energy take a big leap in intensity and possibility. The circle partners are then directed by the group leader to image their hands being like radiant balls of light, like radiant suns, and to begin to share this energy flow, this state of consciousness with the partner in front through their left hands and with themselves through their right hands, which are still being held against the lower anterior chest, the heart center. This is called the experience of sacred touch. The circle partners are then asked to imagine themselves collectively becoming a vortex of light and energy, surrounding and enveloping the partner in the center of the circle. This is done by having the circle partners surrender their sense of individuality and separateness in order to blend and fuse with one another to form a collective sense of self, a vehicle of consciousness capable of transmitting a sacred healing energy. The circle partners do this by receiving the energy flow from the partner behind and simultaneously transmitting an augmented energy flow to the partner in front, and by continuing to imagine the collective vortex of energy that is forming. And I refer to this part of the ritual as the act of sacred communion. As the energy builds, and you can't miss it, the circle partners are instructed to turn inward to the center partner, in this case, partner number one, and to enact the experience of sacred touch with him or her by placing both hands on the center partner, lightly and sensitively. The circle partner should intuitively determine for themselves where to place their hands. We now have a rosette of heightened collective energy focused on the individual in the center. The circle partners are reminded to continue to imagine that they are in the center of a great hallowed space, and that they are being held in the heart radiance of this sacred place. They are then asked to experience themselves as the spokes of a wheel radiating energy to a central hub, directing to the central partner the energies and the forces that they are accessing. The circle partners are asked to feel their hands being like radiant suns and to sense the energy flow penetrating the individual in the center. They are asked to fill the center partner with light and energy, to illuminate the body tissue beneath their hands, to nourish and heal at soul level. The center partners are asked to open themselves fully to the inpouring of the heightening, healing, harmonizing energy, and to become open to receive as they had never been before. The center partners are asked by the group leader to imagine themselves bathed in a healing, heightening, harmonic sphere of light and energy. The leader should allow about 90 seconds to pass, which is a long time in these states of consciousness, before asking the circle partners to return their hands to their own heart centers, to place their left hands on the back or shoulder of the circle partner in front, and again enter the sacred communion with one another. The circle partners' right sides are still turned into the center, gently supporting and nestling the center person. The circle partners are now asked to reconnect again to their individual sacred images and again to feel the heart embrace of the sacred place in their imaginations. The circle partners are sensing energy as being simultaneously given and received, allowing this collectively and personally nourishing experience to deepen and to heighten. The center partner is asked to enter a deep, calm, clear pool of beingness. The circle partners are then asked to join hands while partner number 2 changes places with partner number 1, who returns to the circle. The whole sequence is then repeated for partner number 2, except that the left sides of the circle partners are turned in to the center to gently support the center partner. Their left hands are placed on their own chests, and their right hands are placed on the shoulder or the back of the partner in front. This reversal accomplishes 2 things. It keeps the arms from fatiguing by alternating hands, and it develops a facility in both hands for delivering heightened energetics. Thereafter, each time the sequence is repeated, alternate sides are turned toward the center. Near the end of the ritual, those in the circles that had only 6 persons and who finished before the 7-person circles should stand, arms around waists, and enter a simple communion with one another, while the final individuals in the circle of 7 complete. When sharing with the last individual in the small groups is complete, the group members form a complete circle with no one in the center, with their arms around the waists of the partners on either side. Everyone in the circle enters into an appreciation of each member, a simple, non-verbal communion with one another. All participants are then asked to sit or lie down on the floor or to return to their seats, and after a silent meditation which focuses on deepening their energy experience that has just occurred, to leave the ritual area in silence, each in accordance with his or her own sense of appropriate timing. Often silent, warm embraces are shared as the ritual comes to completion. The importance of collective rituals. There is a great need in our culture for healing, for collective healing and nourishment rituals. The touching itself is beneficial enough, but when the forces are ignited into transcendence, the experience is awesome. A once weekly gathering of any individuals or groups of individuals, friends, temple goers, church members, committee members, members of the police force or street gangs, office workers, physicians, nurses, for touching, healing, heightening, and entering the sacred together might just transform our society and the world we live in. I hope groups will use this format for collective and personal healing. Most individuals in traditional religions still maintain the power in the priest or priestess or the minister by having only that particular person enter a heightened state of consciousness and share it with those in attendance. In this ritual, however, everyone is asked to enter a heightened state of consciousness and to share the energetic experience with the others. Everyone in attendance is therefore empowered, and it also allows people of all faiths and all backgrounds to work together beyond dogmas and differences, to touch one another and to touch the essence together while still honoring the images that are sacred to each of them. My intent thus far has been to present rituals that allow one to experience induction into other areas of awareness, yet still return to the simple self at the end. The simple self is, after all, the aspect of us that experiences most of what we call our life. Now, however, I want to focus on the rituals involved in rites of passage, initiations that induct a new long-term vehicle appropriate to new biological staging, initiations from which we do not return to being the same person that we were before. Rites of passage separate one developmental staging from another and initiate the next vehicle of consciousness, the one that has resources appropriate to the next stage. The early initiations, from fetus to infant, from infant to child, from child to adolescent, are for the most part unconscious. As we pass through these stages, we are not aware of actual initiations. Yet, in many cultures, there are rites and rituals around conception, pregnancy, birth, various stages of childhood performed by family members, the religious community, and or elders. Each stage grants to the individual greater responsibility and authority, but the major conscious initiations wherein the individual is challenged to his or her maximum begin with puberty, when the most powerful aspect of life, the procreative, becomes actualized. The exceptional film called The Emerald Forest, written by Rospo Pallenberg and directed by John Boorman, features one of the male initiation rites of puberty and a subsequent rite of passage into marriage. I will briefly summarize the story. A Caucasian boy, about 7, is abducted by native Brazilian forest people while he is on a family outing near a dam on which his father, an engineer, is working. The father spends the next 10 years trying to locate the son, but without success. Meanwhile, the son is being raised by the chief of the forest people and has developed into a resourceful, though still youthful boy of about 17. We see him at that age playing in the river with a male friend. They are teasing the young girls of the tribe. The boy dives underwater to sneak up on a girl to whom he is attracted. As his head emerges from the water, we see his tribal father and tribal mother standing nearby on a large, flat boulder, tall and serious, close to the water's edge. The forest father says, "The time has come for the boy to die." We see apprehension on the face of the boy, and yet excitement too, as he realizes his boyhood has come to an end. His forest mother tells him she is lamenting because she will never see her little boy again. The next images explosively present the ritual of the rites of passage, in which the boy can no longer afford to be a boy. His initiation requires all the strength and courage of a young man if he is to pass through it without humiliation or physical death. What then transpires is the death of the boy and the birth of the young man, who has the resources to engage and to support his society, as well as to initiate the resources for handling marriage and procreation. This is a very different self from the boy self, since the induction into the next stage will be long-term. The passage back into boyhood must be permanently closed. My working hypothesis is that through the extreme crisis of the initiation, as well as through the forces of tribal social sanctions, the psyche is forced to withdraw its animating forces from the boy self and to infuse the young man's self. The young man is empowered and celebrated, while the boy is ritually released and sacrificed. There is no going back. It is as final as the physical initiation from the fetus to the infant. When the original father finally finds his son, the boy has already been initiated into young manhood. The biological father asks his son if he won't return for his mother's sake. But, as the young man's wife says, he has no further need of a mother. The father is himself initiated and realizes that his boy no longer exists. For the majority of males in our culture, war is the only experience that even comes close to a circumstance that can generate sufficient energy for the rite of passage into young manhood. In wartime, the boy is ripped from the breast of the mother, and from protective family and social conditions, he is exposed to forces that the child or boy cannot handle or resolve, and in the face of which the initiation into manhood can potentially transpire. The next developmental vehicle of consciousness, which has far greater resources and capabilities, is birthed. The deep psyche is not concerned that a devastating event is transpiring to initiate the male. It is only ensuring that the resources contained in the next staging are engaged and manifested. The young man has a new power base, and the society is benefited by his energetics and resources. Obviously, the same holds for the female, provided that her initiation is equally deep and as powerful. In fact, the task for women is even more awesome, as women must integrate the vast feminine principle and break from the power of the father. Unfortunately, the significance of initiation has been lost in our society. We maintain the child-parent relationship far too long, significantly arresting the deeper unfoldment required for full empowerment of the individual. The child self is hardly ever completed and is also ridiculously overvalued. The psychological young man and young woman are never quite birthed. In addition, the sensitive masculine and the masculinized female are extremely popular in today's American culture, while the eldership stages are demeaned. The gods and goddesses of youth reign supreme. Immature stages are not properly sacrificed, and the later stages are ill-defined. Even when there are rituals of confirmation, such as in Catholicism, or rites of passage, such as those in most bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, a strong tendency has arisen to diminish the severity or to minimize the trial through which the child must pass, thus to ensure that all children do actually pass. In other words, the sensitivities of the child are protected, and an actual force of the initiation is diluted to such an extent that the initiation is, in fact, a sham and does not actually take place. The whole purpose of the initiation is thereby lost, as the person remains in the psychological vicinity of the earlier staging, or has easy access to that staging, The probability of a psychological arrestment is high. One should recognize, however, that not all initiations have been diluted in this fashion. Indeed, some carry the threat of permanent physical and or psychological injury and even death. These possibilities are present in many Eastern spiritual rites of passage. The rites of passage for the Aboriginal adolescents in Australia, the initiations of street people and ghetto people in our own American cities, and of course, the initiations of war. I can't begin to count the number of individuals in my conferences who are surprised to find that they are arrested at the infantile and sometimes even fetal psychological levels. The outer awareness thinks it's an adult doing adult things until the deeper nature is unmasked through projections, dreams, or under stress, regression. In fact, much of my initial conference work involves helping individuals prepare for birthing into life, the body, or the next appropriate stage of psychological patterning. Regardless of what our prior difficulties have been, an initiation can commence and staging can proceed once we are aware that an arrestment has taken place and how the forces that are operating to maintain the arrestment can be handled, even if we don't consciously initiate these stages of development. Life, from time to time, will create the circumstances that offer rites of passage. Mature stagings are too important to life for life not to have found ways to force the initiations from generation to generation. In such cases, not all individuals in a group will have the opportunity to be initiated, but there will always be a few who are initiated into more resource-filled vehicles of consciousness. The mystical marriage. I was particularly struck by comments regarding the rites of passage into marriage that were made by Joseph Campbell and Bill Moyers in their PBS television series, The Power of Myth. Campbell noted that in a mature state of marriage, neither partner surrenders to the other. The true process involves both partners surrendering into the unity represented by the marriage itself. In my terms, both enter new vehicles of consciousness, which are based in the mystery of blended forces. The senses of self present prior to the rites of passage into this new, more mystical relationship must die and give way to the deeper, more resourceful, more empowered selves, which can fully engage the challenges and requirements of marriage. The first general staging of marriage satisfies procreative and survival needs. The second general staging brings the couple into mystical union, in which their separate selves dissolve. But where are the marriages that have achieved this mystical relationship, this circumstance that demonstrates the selflessness inherent in the mystery of the second stage? It's no wonder the divorce rate is so high. Not only because most individuals entering marriage have failed to appreciate how powerful the unconscious infant, child, and adolescent are, but also because rites of passage no longer exist that might put them to rest. The rites of passage into marriage bring us into a crucible of development that is beyond anything we imagined in the premarital stages. We certainly aren't prepared to understand that there are many selves in each partner and that no marriage can possibly contain and fulfill all aspects of each partner. There are selves that the partner cannot satisfy or fulfill, even if his or her life depended on it. As this is understood in the mature relationship, one partner will help the other partner to fulfill those aspects through other people outside the marriage. This prepares both partners for the selfless aspects of the mystical marriage that potentially can occur later on. I do not want to simply imply that heterosexual rites of passage into marriage relationships represent the only possible, or for some, even the most desirable pathways into mystical marriage. Outer mores and standards are mostly ignored by the deep psyche anyway. Life has created many paths and many possibilities to engage the mystical marriage. Induction through crisis, trauma as life teacher. We now come to the most popular and most successful method for generating the energy to change vehicles of awareness, creating a crisis. Enormous energy is required to initiate the unawakened person into heightened ranges of human consciousness. For instance, war only initiates individuals, but also initiates an entire society into resources not ordinarily available, nor ordinarily experienceable. Author Doris Lessing, who was born in Turkey, lived in Africa and then England during World War II, now resides in Canada, has written a book called Prisons We Choose to Live Inside, wherein she makes note of people who are psychologically fixated to the times of great wars. These people continually live and relive the excitement and the drama of their war years. They talk as if the war was the peak experience of their lives. And of course, it was. The moment-by-moment threat of devastation, the existence of great causes, the moments of laughter and humor in the face of horrific events and challenges, and the feeling of aliveness that are all reported and remembered by these people. The crises of the moment contributed to a heightening of the experience of life by opening them to greater psychological resources that were available during peacetime. Than were available during peacetime. Let me read that sentence again. The crises of the moment contributed to a heightening of the experience of life by opening them to greater psychological resources than were available during peacetime. Long periods of peace are often soporific in character and lead to stagnation. Lawrence Blair and his brother Lauren, two adventurers into life, recently filmed a documentary on the Indonesian people who live on the sides of active volcanoes. The Blair's observation was that the constant threat of eruption and chaos contributed to a heightened sense of daily life and moment-by-moment experience for these people. They did not take their lives and homes for granted. How many of us have lived through natural disasters or major calamities and found that we were strengthened and awakened through such events? One of the most powerful thoughts I ever had about medicine was a previously taboo concept which, when it occurred to me, renovated my entire understanding of health and disease. I asked myself how a particular disease, injury, or emotional trauma might be serving a deeper aspect of a person. It was as if the gates of awareness parted. Most people experiencing cancer or other life-threatening illness will tell you they came alive under the crisis of the diagnosis. Priorities were suddenly revalued. The petty and infantile were discarded for the meaningful and fulfilling. Relationships that had been taken for granted were heightened. Other relationships, long dead, were discarded. Crises in the form of disease, injury, and emotional pain are forces for change. However, if the underlying patterns of change can be discerned, and if the willingness to make the required changes is substituted for the illness, injury, or emotional pain that is forcing changes, a miraculous potential to dissolve disease and injury patterns can be discovered. Yet, there is so much unconscious secondary pain in disease and injury that most individuals will not want either to see a need for or to effect the required changes. But when the individual is ready for a difficult initiation, the deep self showers its resources and gifts on that part of the self undergoing the change. Crises and stress themselves are not evil or wrong. What makes the difference between our being aborted psychological cripples and mature, natural, and ever-expanding beings is how we deal with crisis and stress. Stanislav Grof, PhD, in his book, Adventure of Self-Discovery, presents some interesting views on the relationship of the birth crisis to life patterns of one's later experience. He notes that during the birth trauma, the fetus is brought into a critical stage with all alarms on. Instinctual, physical, emotional, sexual. This can cause a transcendental experience in the fetus, infant, a peak experience. We also know that massive amounts of endorphins are circulating in its body, inducing a narcotic component to the crisis. The fetus, baby, is experiencing the end of the aquatic phase, all it has known to that point of life. The future is unknown. The trauma of contractions and movements through a very narrow passage, along with bursting into light and air, represent the most dramatic physical and conscious changes it will ever experience, except possibly the changes in consciousness at death. From my perspective, these difficult events are necessary for the next stage to fully initiate. This fetal peak experience also sets the stage for the individual to attempt later to return to that same experience unconsciously, utilizing the same energetics that are present during the birth crisis, including the pain. During the initiation of birth, the trauma is important in activating many physiological and psychological systems, just as the effort put forth by the chick to peck its way out of the egg is necessary for the chick to gain strength for physical survival. The crises surrounding birth are fundamentally necessary. If the chick is helped by someone who good-heartedly opens the egg, the chick usually dies. When I am assisting people in their personal growth, I usually urge them not to redo the birth trauma and not to redo childhood crisis. The fact is simply that the infant vehicle of awareness had to enter. Appearing through the struggle of initiation because the fetus could not handle the new circumstance. I'm going to read that sentence again. The fact is simply that the infant vehicle of awareness had to enter through the struggle of initiation because the fetus could not handle the new circumstance. Likewise, each subsequent vehicle of consciousness must also enter through the struggle of initiation, or major problems occur in later life. This has become even more clear to me as I have worked with large numbers of people, for I have discovered that they are often trying to use infantile psychological patterns to deal with adult crises, while the vehicles of consciousness that could easily handle the crisis or the changes are prevented from entering their awareness. Crisis has the potential to activate rich and mature states of awareness, with capabilities that are not stimulated in unstressed and overly protected infants, children, adolescents, and young adults. In fact, many of the world's most remarkable individuals, whether they have worked for the great good or the great evil, have come from very disruptive or abusive early environments. Difficult circumstances are the basis of great maturational potential if the psyche has been initiated in a way that permits the individual to embrace the necessary sacrifices.